Hello, Dr. Russell. This is my oral exam video, and I'm going to start with music since the 1900s. So this time period had three struggles, and the first one was composers struggled balancing between tradition and innovation. The second one is composers struggled with a balance between high art and audience accessibility. And the last struggle was composers struggled with balancing between individual expressive goals and community relevance. So music was sold and performed literally almost anywhere and still is. That's the internet, YouTube, it can be streamed on the radio. It can be anywhere from the street to the mall, outside, inside, churches, anywhere is where music can be sold or performed. So two composers from this time period that we talked about were Igor Stravinsky, and he produced Petrushka, and then John Cage, who produced the famous 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So I'm going to go into the Romantic period and then talk about the differences between the two. So the Romantic period also had three struggles, and the first one is artists struggling against rather than working within society and convention. The second one being the need for art to unsettle rather than soothe. And then the third one is the belief that works display their creator's distinctive originality and self-expression. So for this period, music was sold on the streets because of syphilis, so composers were kind of forced to selling music on the streets, and music was performed in concert halls. And two performers and composers from this time period are Franz Schubert, and he produced Elf King, and then the second one is Verlois, and he created the Symphonie Fantastique, the March to Scaffold. So, unlike with music from the 1900s, the Romantic period composers focus on the dark side of music to try to make their listeners feel something. Music since the 1900s has a wide range of music tastes that about anyone can find something they like, so it's not just for one individual or another. And the Romantic period pertains more to emotions and the dark, scary side of music, whereas music since the 1900s can be for anyone and everyone. So the next period I'm going to go into is the Classical period. So this period had aspects rather than struggles. So the first one is it was enlightenment and stressed the centrality of research in human experience. The second one is social push toward order and reason. And then the third one is works were characterized by clarity and regularity of structure. So for this period, composers would be hired by patrons to play what the patron wanted, so that was how music was sold. And then it would be performed in the church, palace, and eventually concert halls. But it was primarily formed in the palaces because of the patrons that would hire certain composers to play what they wanted. So two composers and performers of this time were Beethoven, and he produced Moonlight Sonata, and then Mozart produced Ein klein Nachtmusik. And the difference between the Romantic period and the Classical period was that the Romantic period breaks all the rules the Classical period had. During the Classical period, composers would pretend everything was perfect and nice and everything was just perfect. But in the Romantic period, everything was dark and scary. So the next period is the Baroque period, and this period also has aspects. So the first one is music intensifies emotion. The next one is composers and performers are interested in how music could enhance the expression of words. And the third aspect is predictable musical forms and procedures. So churches and patrons are sponsoring and paying for composers, so that's how music is sold in this period. And then music is primarily performed in the church. So two composers from this period are Handel, and he produced The Messiah, and then the second one is Vivaldi, and he produced Four Seasons Spring. And he had all the seasons, but that was the one I chose for my example. So the difference between the classical period and the Baroque period is the classical period is meant to be satisfying and nice for their listeners and patrons at the time. And in the Baroque period, music is written for the church and to be performed in the church. This period came after the medieval Renaissance, and music is primarily for the churches. There are a few composers that don't produce music for the churches, but that's primarily what it was for. Okay. And the last period is the medieval Renaissance period. So this period also has three aspects. The first one being music is seen as a commodity to be preserved, taught, bought, and sold. And then the second one, music was a social activity and individuals feel connected to a group and express feelings. The third one is music notation was invented to further goals of Christian worship. So music in this period was performed and sold in the church and performed in churches primarily and completely. So two composers and pieces from this time are Palestrina, and that was the Pope Marcellus Mass. And then the second one is Hildegard of Bingen, and that was Alleluia o Virginia Mediatrix. And the difference between the Baroque period and the medieval Renaissance period was the Baroque period still has certain artists performing music on their own and away from the church, while in the medieval Renaissance, everything is performed solely for the church and in the church and to be sung in the church. And then another aspect that's different between these two periods are instruments are completely different in the medieval period versus the Baroque period because technology changed everything at the time. And that was my oral exam video, and thanks.